Who am I and why am I here? These are probably the two most important questions you can ever ask yourself in your whole life. So, whatever else you're doing today, I want you to stop and take 16 minutes. This could be the most important 16 minutes of your life. And listen to this message, and you will know the answer to who you are and why you are here.
How does biblical Christianity answer these questions? How does our meta-narrative answer these questions? Well, let me give it to you and then we'll look at it in the text. Creation, fall, redemption, consummation. That's our meta-narrative. Creation, fall, redemption, consummation. But how do we put it in terms of these four questions? Who am I? Why am I here? What is wrong with the world? And how can what is wrong be made right? Well, now let's look at our text in Colossians. Let's look there at that paragraph that begins in verse 15. It reads, He, speaking of Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Who am I? It's interesting that the text starts the answer to that question, who am I, by telling me who he is. Because according to the biblical worldview, according to the Christian meta-narrative, you cannot know or understand who you are apart from knowing and understanding who God is. Because essentially what separates our worldview is that we don't start with man. And that's the issue. The secular human worldview, secular humanism, human. You get that? We start with man and try to answer those questions. That's not the way Christianity answers those questions. We start with God. There is a God who created the world. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven, on earth, visible, invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities. All things were created through him and for him. What that means is who I am is created, and not just created. If we look at the story of creation in Genesis chapter 1, man is not just created. Man is the crowning glory of creation. Amen? Unlike the rest of creation, because man is made in the image of God. I was reading a book today. I read half to 2/3 of the stuff that I read makes me mad. But I know that it will, right? I know that it will. I know that it will beforehand. And it's just, there's a lot of craziness out there. I want to kind of understand where the craziness is coming from. And in this book today, this gentleman who is trying to do his best to come up with a way forward on the whole climate change issue. Title of it, There Is No Planet B. And he lays out really his worldview at the beginning of the book. And he talks about the inherent dignity and value of every human life. And I'm like, that's awesome, man. But then a little bit later on, he talks about the inherent dignity and value of all human things and how his son, when his son learned that a human embryo is about the same size of, this small rodent creature at a certain point in development, his son asked him about the relative value of the human embryo compared to this small rodent creature that is around the same size at a certain point of development. And he admits that he could not answer the question. About relative value. And the reason that he could not answer the question is because in his worldview, the answer to the question, who am I, starts with evolution. Evolution. So there is no distinction in value for him. Man is not the crowning glory of the creation of God for him. And then later on, he starts talking about some other things in the book, and this thing just becomes more and more clear, because then he's talking about the fact that people are living longer and that we're doing such a good job with medicine and people's lives are becoming longer. And some people believe that the first person to live 200 years has already been born. Just think about that. That's a long life, y'all. And what this means for him, because of the population that it's going to create, is that we need to be thinking more critically about when and how we end people's lives. Again, the worldview just shows up, right? It just comes. And it matters. It makes a difference. Our meta-narrative says that everyone does have intrinsic and inherent dignity and value and worth because we're made in the image of God. And that is a completely different starting point than any other worldview. Why is it, for example, that women in the Christian world, and it's interesting, you wouldn't know this to listen, right? I mean, if you listen to the noise out there from a lot of feminist circles, you would think that women in the Christian world have it worse than women anywhere else. But the fact of the matter is that women in Christian cultures are the healthiest, wealthiest, most protected, most prosperous women in the history of mankind. Period. End of discussion. It's not even close. There is no other culture in the world where women are prized more or protected more than in Christian cultures throughout the history of mankind. Never. Never. But why? Because this worldview that sees inherent dignity and value and every human being sees no distinction between the dignity and value of a female person and a male person. Does that mean things have always been great? Nope. But there's an answer. Everybody's been talking a lot about slavery and American slavery. You know what's unique about slavery in America? Not that it existed, because it existed everywhere in the world, and by the way, still exists. And by some measurements, there's more slaves in the world today than there have ever been. You know what's unique about American slavery? We fought to end it. That's what was unique in the history of the world. Not that it existed, because again, every period of history, every culture in history had slavery. Not many of them took up arms to try to end it. And why? Because if we believe in the inherent dignity and value of people because they're created by God and in the image of God, then whether they're male or female, whether they're Jew or Greek, whether they're slave or free. Ooh, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's Galatians 3:28, people. It's Galatians 3:28. And again, upheld perfectly? No. No, that's why we continue to yearn and creation continues to yearn for Christ to come and deliver us from our brokenness, right? But we're going to get there. I don't want to get ahead of myself. That's the consummation part, right? But there's an answer. Just think about it. Teacher, Johnny, don't hit Susie. Johnny, don't take that from Susie. Johnny, don't pull Susie's hair. Johnny, stop it. Why? Because if I'm teaching Johnny that he is the result of random evolutionary processes, then the only thing that ought to matter is if Susie has something he wants and if he's big and strong enough to take it. On what basis and on what grounds do I tell Johnny that he should treat Susie better? Christian theism has an answer. Johnny, Susie's made in the image of God, just like you are. She has inherent dignity and worth and value as one who bears the image of Almighty God. And there's the way that we treat people because they're made in the image of God. See, I can say that to Johnny. The evolutionist can only say that to Johnny if he's inherently dishonest. Who am I? Crown and glory of the creation of God. Okay, so why am I here? Let's keep reading. He is the image of the invisible God, again talking about Christ, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible, invisible, whether thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, all things were created through him and for him. We read that. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body of the church, the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. Let's finish the paragraph. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or on heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Why did I want us to read that? This paragraph, this one and the one after, we're going to look at it, is filled with repetition. Verse 15, firstborn. Verse 17, before all things. Verse 18, head. And then end of verse 18, beginning and firstborn again, and then preeminent. All of that right there in verse 18. So we have firstborn, before, beginning, firstborn, head, preeminent. Think he's making a point? Verse 15, last phrase, all creation. Verse 16, by him all things. And then toward the end of verse 16, all things again. Verse 17, he's before all things again. And in him all things again. Then in verse 18, in everything. And in verse 20, all things. So we got firstborn before, head, firstborn preeminent. And then we got all things, all things, all things, all things, in everything, all things. Do you think there's a point here? Even earlier at the end of verse 16, we saw that all things were created through him and for him. There's repetition there. So there's repetition over and over and over and over again. And what's the repetition there for? To answer the second question. Why am I here? I'm here for the same reason all things are here, to bring glory and honor to the one who created me. That's why I exist. That's why you exist. That's why everything exists. Not everything. Everything. That's beyond everything, y'all. It all exists to bring him glory. Again, do you not feel him making this point? I just want to read it again. Let this just wash over you. He is the image of the invisible God. By the way, that just right there, that's huge. the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible, invisible, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities. All things. By the way, there's a list. That list is to magnify. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things. In him, all things hold together. He is the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. All things, all things, all things, everything, all things. In him, by him, through him, for him. Firstborn, head, beginning, firstborn, preeminent. That's who Christ is. And he has to be, because he's the image of the invisible God, which means he's God, by the way. Not almost God, not kind of God, he's God. Which is why he's before all things. Who am I? Crowning glory of the creation of God. Why am I here? To bring glory and honor to God. Not just to consume and enjoy. Not just to eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we all die. But to bring glory to my Creator.